lecture on the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. Today we will study Nehemiah chapter 13. In verses 1 to 3, the Israelites defeated the Ammonites and the Moabites with the law. The Israelites built the Jerusalem wall after they returned from Babylon. After the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the leaders read from the book of Moses. They read from the book of Deuteronomy, and they removed all Ammonites and Moabites from the assembly of God. Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 3 to 6 says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of its descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord." The Ammonites and Moabites did not help the Israelites at the Exodus, but rather interfered. The Moabites hired Balaam to put a curse on the Israelites, and thus God told the people not to approve of them for as long as they lived. Hence, those who were of Ammonite or Moabite descent were excluded from Israel. The Israelites made a holy distinction in the midst of their integration. God is pleased when believers obey immediately after hearing God's word. God is pleased when we live distinguished lives. God's people must distinguish themselves from others. In verses 4 to 9, Nehemiah purified Tobiah's room in the courts of the temple. Eliashib, the high priest, provided Tobiah the Ammonite a room in the house of God. The high priest allowed Tobiah to use a room in the temple. The room was originally used to store temple equipment, grain offerings, and incense. It was also used to store tithes and portions for those who served in the temple. God told the people never to tolerate the Ammonites. Yet the high priest was wrong in allowing an Ammonite into a room in God's temple. The priests received bribes and allowed Tobiah to enter the temple. Allowing Tobiah into a room in God's temple was well deserving of God's anger. It had not even been a long time since the temple was rebuilt. The priests became corrupted and allowed a foreign power into the temple. The same goes for us today. Corrupt churches defy the Bible, and they allow the customs of the world to enter the church. Nehemiah did not know at first that Tobiah was using a room in the temple. This was because Nehemiah had gone back to Persia in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah found out when he received King Artaxerxes' permission and returned to Jerusalem in the third return. Nehemiah then threw out all of Tobiah's household goods from the room and purified it. Nehemiah then brought back all the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and incense. When Nehemiah chased Tobiah out and purified the temple room, he faced many difficulties. This was because there were many powerful people of Judah who were close to Tobiah and received bribes from him. If these people were to attack Nehemiah, Nehemiah's life would have been in danger. Also, the person who gave Tobiah the room was the high priest Eliashib. The high priest had great power. In the time of Jesus, Jesus was killed after the high priest set him up. However, Nehemiah faced danger and restored the temple room to its original state because it did not agree with God's word. In verses 10 to 14, Nehemiah brought the Levites together and stationed them at their posts, and the people of Judah brought their tithes. Nehemiah found out that the people had not given tithes. Hence, the Levites struggled to make a living. The Levites had no choice but to return to their towns and farm, and they no longer did temple work. Therefore, in verse 11, Nehemiah rebuked the officials. Nehemiah then brought the Levites together and made them serve in the temple. He also made the people give tithes. Hence, the Levites were able to receive living expenses. In verse 10, it says that the Levites had gone back to their own fields. Men who served in God's temple could not receive pay, and hence they ran away. This was wrong. Even if God's servants face difficulties, they must not run away, but be faithful to their offices. People who do God's work must have faith to be content to do God's work. Then God will surely provide them with food. In verse 14, Nehemiah spoke to God. Remember me for this, O my God. Nehemiah taught the people God's law and chased out the Ammonites and Moabites. Nehemiah chased Tobiah out from the temple and purified it. Then Nehemiah brought back and stationed the Levites who would serve in God's temple. Nehemiah prayed that God would remember this. God surely remembers all things and gives rewards for them. Anything that is done for God, for the temple, done according to the Bible and given for God, will remain forever in heaven. In verses 16 to 31, it tells us what Nehemiah did to receive the Lord's great grace. In verses 22 and 31, God remembered the works of Nehemiah. Nehemiah acted in ways that pleased the Lord. Nehemiah acted in ways that God would remember and bless him. Nehemiah received God's great grace and was loved by God. First, in verses 15 to 22, Nehemiah made the people observe the Sabbath. Nehemiah made the people keep the Sabbath day, which was worthy of God's remembrance and great grace. Second, in verses 23 to 27, Nehemiah forbade the people from intermarrying with foreign peoples. Third, in verses 28 to 31, Nehemiah established order in the work the Levites were to do. This was worthy of God's blessing. Nehemiah was worthy to receive God's great grace. Nehemiah did good works. The Lord would pour out his grace on Nehemiah. This was worthy of blessings. We must live as Nehemiah did. In verses 15 to 22, Nehemiah did things that resulted in God's great grace. Nehemiah acted with his heart, his words, and with his works. Nehemiah made the people keep the Sabbath. Nehemiah made the people keep the Sabbath, and this was worthy of God's great grace. Verse 15 says, In those days, Nehemiah completed his duties as governor for 12 years, went to King Artaxerxes, and returned. Nehemiah returned, and he again established a way to serve God. Nehemiah corrected disorder and confusion. Nehemiah made the people bring tithes and offerings. Nehemiah made the Levites return. There were people at the time who did not keep the Sabbath. They treaded wine presses and brought in grain on donkeys. The people brought wine, grapes, figs, and other kinds of loads to Jerusalem and sold them. We must not buy and sell on Sundays. Sundays are not working days. Yet these things took place in Judah. The Israelites did not keep the Sabbath. Today, it would be like believers who do not keep Sundays holy. There were many cases in Judah where people did not keep the Sabbath. Hence, Nehemiah worked to correct this with the power and authority given to him by God. Nehemiah made God happy. The people made the mistake in failing to keep the Sabbath. First, they treaded wine presses, brought in grain on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and other kinds of loaves, and sold them. Today, we must not buy or sell on Sundays. In the latter half of verse 15, Nehemiah warned the people. Nehemiah helped the people understand. Nehemiah could not stay silent. Nehemiah had no choice but to punish the people. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11 says, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." Keeping the Sabbath is included in the 10 Commandments. It is the 4th commandment. It teaches us how to keep the Sabbath. We must not let our children work on the Sabbath. We must not let servants or livestock work. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12 says, "Also I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between us." Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 20. What is the sign of believers of Jesus? The sign is the believers who keep Sundays holy. When we keep Sundays, it becomes the sign of faith in Jesus. If we do not keep Sundays, we are not believers. We would be unbelievers. Unbelievers do not have God. They live however they want. The most important commandment today and in the past is to keep the Sabbath. We must keep it by even laying down our lives. We must keep this commandment no matter what. Nehemiah had to punish the people for what happened in Judah. Failure to keep the Sabbath in Judah was similar to yeast. It was similar to cancer that spread through the body. One must cut off the cancer. If we leave the cancer as it is, it will spread and kill the person. Nehemiah could not let the people be, and hence he warned the people. Why did the people sin in verse 15? There was grain, wine, grapes, and figs. These were all materials. These were all worldly materials. The people of Judah sinned because of such worldly materials. We must transcend materials. Nothing will matter if we do not transcend materials. We must use our materials for faith. We must take our materials and use it in our faith. We must not be slaves to money. It is pitiful for someone to become a slave to money. If we do not transcend materials, we will become like the people of Judah. We must cut off all things that are wrong. God's wrath will pile up if we continue to be taken captive by sins. The sin of failing to keep the Sabbath is a very fighting sin. We must not be slaves to materials. We must overcome materials, and we must live by faith. Second, men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem brought fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the people of Judah on the Sabbath. In verse 16, sin entered through the people of Tyre. The people of Tyre were from Phoenicia. There were 2 large harbors in Phoenicia. They were Sidon and Tyre. Merchants in Tyre were very skilled in business. However, Exodus chapter 20 verse 10 says, "On it you shall not do any work, nor the alien within your gates." The men of Tyre sold merchandise that the people of Judah liked on the Sabbath. What kind of sin was this before God? According to verse 17, it is a very wicked thing. It was a sin. Who took the lead in committing this sin? It was the nobles. It was the officials. It was the heads of families. This also happened in Ezra's time. Ezra chapter 9 verse 2 says, "The leaders and officials led the way in unfaithfulness." What does it say in verse 18? Because they desecrated the Sabbath, God brought calamity upon the city. The people were taken into exile in Babylon for 70 years because the people of Judah desecrated the Sabbath. We become slaves of the devil if we desecrate the Sabbath. We become slaves of the world and slaves of money, and we become miserable. Then God's wrath will be on us. We will live in darkness. We must live by faith like Nehemiah. Nehemiah stood upright in the truth. In verses 19 to 20 were ways to keep the Sabbath. First, the gates of Jerusalem were shut. They shut the gates before the Sabbath when it began to grow dark. Until when did they keep the gates closed? They were not to open the gates until the Sabbath was over. The city gates were shut on the Sabbath. If believers do not listen, there will be physical punishment. We will be punished if we do not obey God's word. God will have no choice but to punish us. Thus, the city gates were closed shut. One day for the Jews was the time from sunset to sunrise the next day. It was from evening until evening the next day. Hosea chapter 2 verse 6 says, "There will be thorn bushes if we do not obey God's word. We will be in great pain if we face thorn bushes. If believers do not obey, God will put up walls. God works so that we can be upright." Second, verse 19 says that men were stationed at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. If believers disobey, all doors will be closed shut. The doors of success, prosperity, and all doors will be closed shut. All doors will be closed shut if we do not keep the Sabbath. We will be punished. We do not know where thorn bushes will sprout up if we do not keep our faith. We must fear God. We must fear sin. We must correctly believe in Jesus. We must live upright in faith. In verse 20, it says that merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods came even when the city gates were shut. What did these merchants love? They loved money. Our faith will grow when we throw away love for money. 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10 says, "The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." This causes people to sin. People kill, lie, sell their conscience and their faith because of love of money. We must be content. We must be satisfied with God. We must be thankful for the present time. We must be thankful for the small things. We must use our materials for faith. We must not be slaves to materials. Why did God give us materials? God did not give them to us so that we could store them. Fertilizer is of no use if it is left piled up when one is farming. Fertilizer becomes useful when it is scattered on soil. Money is like fertilizer. We must scatter money. Our money will rot away if we keep it piled up. In verse 21, Nehemiah forced the believers to obey. Nehemiah said, "I will lay hands on you." In verse 19, Nehemiah stationed men to guard the gates. They were temporary workers. In verse 22, Nehemiah commanded the Levites to continuously guard the city gates. They purified themselves and guarded the gates. Nehemiah worked hard. Here, the people of Judah disobeyed the law, and the men of Tyre sinned as well. Nehemiah shut the city gates, and he made the Levites keep the Sabbath. Nehemiah helped lessen God's wrath. He was a man after God's own heart. We must be believers like Nehemiah in this generation. What type of person did God search for in Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1? God sought one person up and down in the streets of Jerusalem who sought the truth. We must live righteously and seek the truth in our lives, in our workplaces, in churches, in families, and at jobs. We must be that one person whom God searches for. What type of person did God seek in Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 30? God looked for a man who built up the wall and stood before God in the gap so that God would not have to destroy it. God's city is falling. The city of truth is falling. Churches today are becoming social organizations. Hence, churches cover the glory of God. Some people attend church to earn money. Some attend church to be healed of their sicknesses. Mysticism is growing popular. Churches are walking down wrong paths. In these times, we must build up the wall of truth. We must stand so that the wall is not destroyed. There was a scarcity of such believers in Ezekiel's time, and there is a scarcity today as well. We must have faith. We must receive God's great grace like Nehemiah did. In verses 23 to 31, Nehemiah did something that God would remember and bless him for. First, Nehemiah cursed those who married foreign women. In verse 23, there were men who married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. They married foreign women. The truth had fallen. The men of Judah married foreign women. Half their children spoke the languages of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Ashdod was one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. If you look at a map, Ashdod is located to the west of Israel. Sin entered from the west. Ammon and Moab were located to the east of the Jordan River. Sin entered from the east. In this way, sin enters from the east and from the west. Sin comes to us like water. Water flows even through a hole. Water flows even through a small hole. This generation is filled with sin. This was not something that happened only in Nehemiah's time. The people of Judah married foreign peoples even in Ezra's time. In verse 24, the people of Judah became like foreign peoples. Children did not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of Ashdod. Nehemiah did not let this continue, but took action. In verse 25, the people were rebuked for marrying foreign women. This was deserving of punishments. This was a terrible sin. It was a frightening sin. Nehemiah hated sins completely. Next, Nehemiah made them take an oath in God's name. Nehemiah did this to prevent them from committing the same sins again. We must strive to make things upright. We must properly teach believers. In verse 26, Nehemiah used Solomon as an example to rebuke the people. Solomon had 1,000 wives. Solomon listened to his wives and served idols. Then the nation was split under the rule of Solomon's son. Solomon was a very wise king. Then why was he ruined? It was because he married foreign women. Pastors must especially be careful of 2 things. They must be careful of women and money. In verse 27, Nehemiah said that the sin of marriage with foreign women was an unacceptable sin. In verses 28 to 31, Nehemiah established order for the Levites. In verse 28, it says that one of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Sanballat was the man who interfered with the building of the city wall. He was a very wicked man. He was an enemy of the people of Judah. Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. However, the grandson of Eliashib the high priest married Sanballat's daughter. Hence, Nehemiah chased them out. How did sin enter? Sin entered through the high priest's family. The priests married foreign women. Leviticus chapter 21 verse 14 says, priests must not marry foreign women. A priest was to marry a virgin from his own people. In verse 29, the priests defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the Levites. And hence Nehemiah governed over them. In verse 30, Nehemiah restored the duties of the Levites. In verse 31, he made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. We must build up a proper church as Nehemiah did. This will truly be worthy of God's blessings. Here we will conclude the 15th lecture on Ezra and Nehemiah. Thank you.